And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you could join us. And if it sounds a little bit different, although perhaps it does not, we are broadcasting today from South Carolina. And so this is going to be just a great opportunity, first of all, to look at a number of issues in the news. Matter of fact, we're going to be spending some time talking about the vote in the House of Representatives to establish a commission to investigate the Capitol riots. There has been a meeting now to evaluate whether or not we should add more members to the Supreme Court, and Kelly Shackelford has had some things to say about that. We'll look at the crisis at the border and the fact that, as we mentioned just the other day, there are all sorts of evidence that this is not just people coming from Mexico or the Northern Triangle, but from 160 countries around the world. So we'll get into that. Since we are broadcasting indeed from South Carolina, there's a very good op-ed that came out from Senator Tim Scott about Senate Bill 1 having to do with voting. And he says this is not a voting rights bill. It's actually a partisan power grab. And there's been a pushback to some of the woke corporate politics. So we just have a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. But first of all, we are broadcasting today from WAGP. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes, if I could, talking to the general manager, Rick Forshner. We've talked to you on the phone, but it's the first time I've had a chance to meet you face to face. And thank you for inviting us into your studio today.
Well, thank you, Kelly, Kirby and Kelly. You've got Warren Kelly here, who's your president of Point of View, joining us as well. And the pleasure is all ours. We've actually tried to get you guys here a couple of times in the past, and the strangest things happened whenever we would invite you. You would get ice storms in Dallas and floods, and so I was beginning to wonder whether the Lord didn't want you here, but we've got a beautiful day in the Low Country, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, we had a few issues ourselves. We got here, but the suitcases did not get here. And next time I'm going to go, I'm going to say, well, I want to go to Dallas, but I want my suitcase to go to Chicago. And say, well, we can't do that. So he did it last time. So we'll see where this goes. But give us just real quickly, because we have listeners all over the country. And from time to time, we love to go to one of the stations. And we've been in Alaska. Tomorrow we'll be in Georgia, by the way. But can you give us kind of a brief history of WAGP, because this is just a phenomenal facility that you put together?
Well, thank you. It wasn't me that put it together. The Lord was really the one that has orchestrated the growth of this station. It's interesting. When I first became aware of WAGP, I was actually living in Beaufort, working for a cable television company. I was managing cable systems around the country, and I was stationed here. And we were getting some interference on one of our channels, and I called the nearest radio station that had the frequency that was close to the one that was being interfered with. And I was at that time introduced to the previous general manager, Charlie Smith, and we spoke a little while. He turned the transmitter off to accommodate me, to make sure that wasn't the problem. It was not the problem. And long story short, we never saw each other until about 10 years later. In the meantime, Charlie developed this radio station. It was actually a desire of the Community Bible Church Board of Elders to develop a radio station, a Christian radio station that would serve the Low Country, which is what we call this area, before they actually built a building to accommodate the church. And so all of the FCC paperwork was filed and everything came together, and on December of 1986, the transmitter switch was turned on, and we were operating at 3,000 watts at actually a totally different frequency. And I shared with this with you at lunch. We have seen some amazing things that the Lord has orchestrated in this radio station. Shortly after we turned on the radio station transmitter, the desire came about to increase our signal strength, but the engineer said, "No, you just can't do it. You're locked in." And he said, "But it's too bad, because I've got another radio station down in Savannah that I do work for, and they'd like to go to a higher power too." And it's interesting, if you were able to turn the frequencies around, you gave them your frequency and they gave you theirs, well, you could do that. But the FCC never does anything like that.
But they did.
Well, yeah. And Charlie said, well, let's just pray about it. And it's interesting because Charlie had actually witnessed to our engineer and brought him to faith in Jesus Christ. So we were all excited because it wasn't long after that we filed the paperwork, it got approved, and we went to 6,000 watts. Well, in the meantime, and I don't know how much time we've got here, but I took a job in Seattle, and I had come to faith in Christ while I was here in Beaufort the first time. And in the Pacific Northwest, you know, of course, that it's a pretty spiritually dry area. I don't need to tell you about Portland, but I was really looking for a good church and couldn't find one that was Bible-based. And I started listening to Christian radio. And I don't know if you're familiar with Christa Ministries.
Oh, very much so, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
up there in Seattle.
Started
Yes.
listening to them, and I was just delighted. And I just prayed to God one day, along with my wife, Deb, and we said, you know, if there were ever an opportunity to manage or own a Christian radio station, Lord, would you open that door for us? And that was back in 1990. So ended up going to work for Time Warner, got transferred to Orlando, but we really missed the slower lifestyle, and an opportunity came to come back to Beaufort. And so we did that in 92, and I joined a social club like the Rotary, and I met Charlie Smith again, the previous manager. And we exchanged pleasantries, and we went ahead and became good friends. I never told him about that prayer. I was still working in cable television, but I was getting disenchanted. The programming was getting increasingly worse. And one day, out of the blue in '96, Charlie says, would you ever consider quitting your job and taking over the radio station? I said, this is an answer to prayer, Charlie. And so I've been here since 1997. And then to see what the Lord has done in the coverage of this radio station is another amazing story. And I don't know how much time we have.
But you went to 100,000 watts.
We did.
Yes.
We did. First to 25,000 watts. Again, people told us, you can't do that. The FCC never approves us. And lo and behold, circumstances worked around. We're at 25,000 watts. And then, by the grace of God again, we are now at 100,000 watts serving Savannah and a lot of the area just south of Charleston.
Well, again, thank you for your hospitality, and it is an incredible story. And if people ever want to know, they can contact you, because we sometimes call it a God thing, and it was definitely a God thing all the way through. So absolutely. Thank you for the hospitality. Let me just mention, too, that next hour we'll get maybe a conversation briefly with Dr. Carl Broggie, because he is the pastor at Community Bible Church, a DTS graduate, a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary with his doctorate from Southwestern, and also involved in, of course, Search the Scriptures, which you help him with as well. So we do need to take a break. When we come back, let's get into some of the issues in the news, and we're going to continue to cover this. And as a program note, let me just mention, we're going to be up there in Georgia tomorrow. So it's been a lot of fun to actually get to meet some of the individuals, either in the various radio stations or the networks involved in some of the broadcast. But we do need to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to cover some more issues right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
If you pay people for not working, then people aren't likely to go out and look for work. Most of us would think that's basic common sense, but apparently that eluded so many in Congress, except for a few senators like Ben Sass and Lindsey Graham. Months ago, they warned that providing high unemployment benefits to those out of work would create a disincentive. 2 weeks ago, the April jobs report lamented that there were only 266,000 jobs created in the month. Economists have been predicting more than 1 million jobs would be created in April. At the time, the president had difficulty explaining why so few jobs were created, but he was sure that it was Trump's fault. In fact, he made the unbelievable claim that there were no measurable data that people weren't looking for jobs because it pays more not to work. You know, the president needs to get out more and talk to employers trying to do all they can to hire people for positions readily available. One article did a quick calculation and concluded that workers could get nearly $16 an hour by staying home. That is more than double the federal minimum wage. Bank of America estimated that anyone making less than $32,000 or less would be better off staying on unemployment than going back to work. More than a week ago, Senator Ben called this a clear policy failure at work. There are 7.4 million jobs open in the United States, but fewer than 300,000 people found work. Senator Tim Scott concluded that Democrats are disincentivizing work, pushing billions of wasteful spending, and threatening major tax hikes. Sadly, the president and Congress don't seem interested in changing course. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again here, broadcasting from WAGP, and this is an opportunity for you to look at some of the issues in the news. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Already have a phone call coming in, and we'll be glad to try to take those remote broadcasts today. But let's, if we can, look at a couple of issues in the news before I take some of those phone calls. And that is, there has been an ongoing question as to whether or not to establish a commission, an independent commission, to investigate the Capitol riot on January 6th. It passed yesterday in the House of Representatives, 252 to 175, without much support from the Republican leadership there. There has been some real concern surfacing from some of the Republicans. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, for example, expressed his disapproval. And many have said that, look, if you're just going to focus on one issue, that is January 6th and the Capitol riot, and ignore all the other kinds of riots taking place, first of all, there's a concern. Second of all, as some commentators have pointed out, people thinking that an independent commission is a good idea probably have a much more rosy feel of this, because you can think about independent commissions that investigated everything from going all the way back to Bill Clinton, all the way more recently to Donald Trump. And sometimes with a runaway independent prosecutor with all sorts of subpoena power and an unlimited budget, all sorts of things get off the rails pretty quickly. So nevertheless, even though it did pass the House of Representatives, it now goes to the Senate. The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has already announced his opposition to it. And the real issue is that if indeed this is even going to happen, there are going to have to be at least 10 Senate Republicans, assuming all the Democrats vote for it, and that's not necessarily guaranteed as well, that 10 Senate Republicans are going to have to vote for it. Even people that might have been inclined to possibly vote for it, I'm thinking, for example, of Senator Susan Collins, said that there'd have to be a lot of revisions before she could support it. So this may just be another one of those examples that we've talked about on the program before of kind of a statement, and then it's used by Democrats to say the Republicans don't want to get to the bottom of this, and Republicans say this is a good example of an attempt to derail the kind of legislative action that needs to take place. In case you say, well, don't we need to get to the bottom of this? Don't we need to investigate this? Well, yes, there are already investigations taking place, and so there is a concern as to whether or not this would be a fair amount of political theater, but there is the case. Again, let me just give you a quote or two. Kevin McCarthy in the House said, given the political misdirections that have marred this process, given the now duplicative and potentially counterproductive nature of this effort, and given the Speaker's short-sighted scope that does not examine interrelated forms of political violence in America, I cannot support this legislation. That's kind of a good summary of the things I've just mentioned, because indeed this is not the only riot or the only conflict that has taken place, even in Washington, D.C., much less around the country. And so we'll maybe set that aside, but simply mention the fact that yesterday there was a vote on the Capitol Riot Commission. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but here's something that may be of greater concern, and that is that you may remember a number of months ago, there was the argument by President Joe Biden that he might want to put together a commission to study the Supreme Court. So last month, in April, he actually signed an executive order creating what's called the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. And it will be looking at a number of things, including whether or not to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Well, if you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, you know that our friend Kelly Shackelford, who oftentimes joins us on a Friday roundtable, who is also the president, CEO, and chief counsel for First Liberty, has said this is a really bad idea. And here's his statement that came out just the other day. Kelly Shackelford said, Americans know that adding seats to the United States Supreme Court or lower courts is nothing more than a partisan power scheme to achieve purely political objectives. He goes on to say that transforming the Supreme Court into another partisan body would destroy the independence of the judiciary and threaten the civil liberties of all Americans. Court packing is a coup that should be emphatically rejected. Now, I love his comments, but more to the point, you might remember that he released on our program, Point of View, a study that was done by the Mason-Dixon Polling and Strategy. This was a study that found that 2/3 of Americans oppose adding seats to the Supreme Court. This is something that did not go well for Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 1930s. I don't think that it will go any better now. And what I thought was so interesting is when you have 68% of those individuals who oppose court packing, you can see that this is the case. And it was a very significant majority of Republicans, but also majority even of independents on this particular case. And so when you start looking at some of the surveys that were done there as well, that is the case. And if you look at even some of the Democrats themselves who would have to vote for this, for example, let's look at Arizona for just a minute. Arizona has, of course, Mark Kelly and Kristen Sinema, both Democrats. Nevertheless, First Liberty found that 64% of registered voters in Arizona oppose that. So you've got to believe that these two senators might think twice before they would want to vote for that. Another, if you will, swing vote is Senator Joe Manchin. And his is from the state of West Virginia. And again, you had about 68% of voters in West Virginia that oppose it. So the bottom line is, let's hope it goes nowhere. But of course, we've talked in the past about what indeed could unfold. If you'd like to join us, we'd love to get your calls. And along the way, of course, this is going to be done digitally. We're going to do our best to see if we can pick a phone call out here. So I want to go, first of all, to our caller in Georgia on the Good News Network. Dan, I think you wanted to add something to our conversation.
Yes, I'm listening with interest because back in the early 80s, I was stationed at Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, South Carolina, and a good friend named Dennis Page said that he had just gotten back from the Moody Bible Institute, and he met a church planter named Phil Spry, who are very successful in planting churches around the country. And Dennis said, we're going to start a church in Beaufort that's a biblically based church, and we're going to call it Community Bible Church. Well, they were very good at setting up the church, and obviously it's still there. They encouraged a lot of us to go on to ministry. I went on to the Moody Bible Institute myself, and I was not around for the starting at WAGP, but heard all the reports of what was going on over the subsequent years, and it's just been fun listening to this from someone else's perspective.
Well, again, I appreciate you sharing that because Dr. Carl Broggie will be with us in about an hour. I just thought I'd chat with him briefly because he's the pastor. And in particular, he's just got some really strong comments about the importance for pastors to address issues from a biblical point of view from the pulpit, which he does. He also has got really strong convictions about the need for us to be engaged in evangelism. Of course, that's one of the things we talk about, evangelism and apologetics here on Point of View. So I thought I would drag him in. I'm hoping we'll have him. I always say jokingly that members of Congress do not control their lives. Second is pastors do not control their lives, but he thinks he can sneak out enough in a little about a half an hour from now. We'll chat with him briefly. And matter of fact, his latest series for some of you that are pastors, that is part of his Search the Scriptures radio broadcast right now, was 3 responsibilities of pastors and his people. And I just thought it would be helpful to talk about that as well. So we'll get him in there. But thanks for giving us a little bit of the history. It's just incredible to see some of these church plants. Go ahead.
Yeah, that would be interesting because that was one of the things that Phil Spry actually started in sending men out, was teaching how to preach expository sermons, and he taught a class that I was able to teach to others. So the whole idea of 2 Timothy 2:2 came from that church. Teach these things to faithful men who will be able to teach others. And I'm glad to see and hear that WAGP and Community Bible Church is still set out and doing what we hope they would when we planted the church.
Well, you're up there in Georgia. We're going to be in Augusta, Georgia tomorrow, broadcasting from the headquarters of Good News Network. And if sometime along the way we can cross paths, I'd love to shake your hand.
Great. Tell them I said hi. We listen to them every day. Thank you. God bless you.
Well, let's take a break, and when we do so, we'll come back and want to talk a little bit more about what is happening at the border. And, of course, my commentary today, which we'll get to a little bit later, gets into some very important aspects of the fact that there's a lot of help wanted signs out there. We got more people that don't want to work necessarily. I don't think they're lazy. They just recognize they're getting paid more to stay home. And some respects, you understand that as well. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll get into woke politics and just all sorts of other topics that we'll be addressing here on Point of View. Need to take a break, though, and we are broadcasting today from WAGP right here in South Carolina. We'll be in Georgia tomorrow, and then they're going to let me come back in the studio back on Monday. Looking forward to that opportunity. So I hope that this is an interesting set of conversations, and as you can see, even though I'm not in the studio, I can take those phone calls. So we'll take some of your phone calls and be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, we are broadcasting from WAGP, which is in South Carolina. Tomorrow we'll be in Georgia. Great opportunity for you to hear a little bit more about that. And for those of you in South Carolina that'll be joining with us tonight, looking forward to meeting you. Or for those of you in Georgia, meet you tomorrow night. But let me just mention that as we get back into issues in the news, first of all, my commentary today is entitled Unfilled Jobs. And the reason I do that is because there seems to be a lack of common sense. Matter of fact, I even preached a sermon recently on the lack of common sense. And I think I may do it again because I start the commentary by saying if you pay people for not working, then guess what? People aren't likely to go out and look for work. And most of us think that's basic common sense. But apparently, as I point out, that's eluded some members of Congress, like Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska. Or since we're in South Carolina today, how about Senator Lindsey Graham? And also, a little bit later, I'm going to be quoting Senator Tim Scott, two senators from South Carolina. And they all were warning months ago, along with Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and others, there are quite a number, that, you know, if you just provide too high of unemployment benefits, then that would be a disincentive. Now, I've seen some people really react to this and say, well, you're saying that Americans are lazy. No, I think there are some lazy people. I've met them, and you have too. But oftentimes, they're also sitting there saying, if I can make more by not working, why would I go to work? And that's just a prudent judgment about, you know, the potential dangers of COVID-19 or a variety of other things. But the reason I bring it up is last month, we had the April jobs report, and you know that, as we've mentioned on this program, only 266,000 jobs were created. And to put that in perspective, the estimates from the economists were that there would be probably 1 million jobs that would be created by April. And this may be the largest miss in decades. And so even though in the midst of this, you've had this president say, oh, I don't think that was a problem. As a matter of fact, there was a statement where President Joe Biden said there was no measurable data that people aren't looking for jobs because it pays more not to work. And my favorite line was, I think the president just needs to get out a little bit more and talk to some of the employers. But if nothing else, there were some calculations, which I put in this commentary so that you can post it on your Facebook page, maybe post it on a Twitter feed or something like that. And the bottom line is that some people estimate that you'd almost have to be making about $16 an hour or more to justify not staying home. And when you realize that is more than double the federal minimum wage, that's the case, then you look at, and since people might say, well, where did that number come from? Well, first of all, it came from some people that were running the numbers, but how about Bank of America? Bank of America estimated anyone making less than $32,000 a year would be better off staying on unemployment. So obviously, this is a problem. We have a crisis with inflation. We have a crisis we're going to talk about in just a minute with immigration. We have a crisis, obviously, in the Middle East that we've been talking about, and yet there is just an unwillingness to acknowledge some of that. So my final comments are, first of all, Senator Ben Sasse, he wrote a very good piece, and I just summarized a point in which he says this is very clearly a policy failure because there are, as best estimates, 7.4 million jobs open in the United States, and fewer than 300,000 people found work in April. I was just talking with Rick just a minute ago, the station manager here, and he says, you know, wherever I go here in South Carolina, I see help wanted. As a matter of fact, I think Karen put a picture up here. Join our team. We're hiring because we're seeing those everywhere. And so that's one issue. And back to somebody I'm going to quote from again in just a minute, Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. He concluded that, quote, Democrats are disincentivizing work, pushing billions of wasteful spending and threatening major job hikes. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later, a very good piece that came from Phil Gramm, who I always appreciated because he was not first an economics professor, then a member of the United States Senate, and he's talked about some of those issues. But let me get to one of the columns that we have posted for you on the website. We've posted a couple of them, but one of those is the whole issue of where are these individuals crossing the border in record numbers coming from. And it turns out, as I shared the other day, they're not just coming from Mexico or Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. They are coming from all over the world. And so Mark Krikorian puts it this way: people around the world are responding to La Invitación, delivered by President Biden through his campaign rhetoric and executive actions, in which they have now reached a 21-year high on the border of those families which are coming, obviously, not just from the usual countries of Mexico and what are called kind of the Northern Triangle countries, but also from many others as well. And you don't even have to accept Mark Krikorian's comments. These now I'm going to be citing from some of the material in the New York Times, so you know it must be true, in which they are saying that they're not just coming from Venezuela, Ecuador, and Brazil, but from India and the Middle East. As a matter of fact, the reporter quotes a director of a shelter in Tucson that helps illegal immigrants after they've been released into the United States by Border Patrol, saying, quote, "We've never worked with so many individuals, such large numbers with this diversity. They're now having to have Border Patrol agents that can speak Arabic, Haitian Creole, Hindi, and Portuguese, to mention just a few." This is not just Spanish now. Now, this being the New York Times, of course, they also talked about the fact that this is all due to the pandemic, but I think we know exactly what's going on there, and that is, just think if you were in one of these countries and you wanted to get to the United States, they're now finding individuals, sometimes in India and a variety of other countries that are in the Southeast Asian area. They try to figure out a way that they can take a flight, usually going there to, sometimes they land in Dubai or somewhere else and then go from Dubai to Mexico City, and then they take a bus to the border and cross over. But again, the Border Patrol agents, again, I'm quoting them now, say that they have apprehended people from, quote, more than 160 countries, and the geography coincides with the path of the virus's worst devastation, unquote. And that's, of course, the New York Times trying to say it's all due to the pandemic. And, of course, that's part of it. You can imagine the difficulty that maybe you or your family have had right now in trying to earn an income with a pandemic and lockdown. But imagine if you're in a country where you're a day laborer. In other words, you work that day to have enough money to buy food for that night, what has happened because of this. And so if nothing else, part of it is, of course, geography. But also, Mark Krikorian says that as word spreads, more people will be coming from farther and farther afield to take advantage of these, if you will, limited time offer from President Biden of an open border. And so the New York Times, let me quote again from them, say the numbers in coming months are expected to be higher, unquote. So this is an article that I wanted you to have for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm only summarizing parts of the 3 pages, and you can read it in its entirety. But more importantly, it just illustrates again that while we're being told that there's no crisis at the border, that this is just a seasonal phenomenon, it is not. And this is probably one of the better articles that you can find to document that. And of course, the argument is being made that these are individuals who claim asylum. Well, again, we do provide asylum for those who are being persecuted. Understand that. But look at this particular statement that came down here, again, from the New York Times. Measures imposed under the Obama administration, such as fitting migrants with ankle monitors to ensure that they will attend court hearings later, are only sparingly used. And so, again, one of the things we're seeing is that they will come to the border. They say we're seeking asylum, so they'll be processed. They'll be told to come back for a court hearing. Some of those court hearings don't even take place within the next year. But then it's not like we're putting ankle monitors on them. And so it is a classic illustration of what I call catch and release. You know, I love to do fly fishing. Catch and release works really good for fly fishing. It doesn't work very good for immigration, and that's exactly what we're dealing with right now. And so that is our second article that we have posted there for you today. Illegals are coming from all over the world. And so the next time you hear somebody say, well, this is just people from Mexico. No, it's not. Even, and I underscore, even the New York Times acknowledges that we are talking about people that are now crossing the border from more than 100 160 countries around the world. Let me take a break, though, and when we come back, I think we've got some other phone calls, and if you'd like to join the conversation, maybe you have a comment about immigration, then if not, we will certainly by the next hour get into the woke corporations. I've said before the old phrase, go woke, get broke. And so we'll see where that goes. Senator Tim Scott, very good op-ed that talks about Senate Bill 1. And then we're going to talk about were some of these actions by this administration actually hurting the economy? Of course they are. But I thought we'd take some people that have some great credentials there, like Phil Gramm and Senator Rick Scott, former Senator Phil Gramm, a former economics professor, giving you some documentation for that. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, we might take some phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212, broadcasting from WAGP. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, broadcasting from WAGP. Let me just mention, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We may take some of those phone calls. If not, we'll get to those next hour. And one of the things that we were talking about off-air with Rick is that he has been on the board of the local Pregnancy Resource Center, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back here again. I'd love to do that. And by the way, I'm bringing my wife next time because she wants to spend some time in Charleston and Savannah and a number of other places. And it has been just really nice. The biggest problem is They serve barbecue here, and I just heard we're going to get barbecue tomorrow in Georgia. So if I fall asleep during the program at any point, just wake me up because it's so good, and we have certainly enjoyed the hospitality of everyone. But let me just mention, while we were talking about the Pregnancy Resource Center yesterday in the state of Texas, Governor Abbott actually signed the fetal heartbeat bill. I was looking at the picture of that and a number of interviews that we've done with Senator Angela Paxton and Senator Hughes and others, but there was also Chelsea Ullman, who is, of course, going to be the host on the Monday Millennial Roundtable, so she was in the picture there as well. So we have been kind of following some of these abortion issues, not the least of which, of course, this very important case from Mississippi that the Supreme Court has decided to hear next year. So we'll be following the pro-life issue for quite some time. And if nothing else, kudos to a number of people involved in getting the fetal heartbeat bill passed in the state of Texas, very similar to those being passed in a variety of other states. Just before we take a break, let me, if I can, come back to this idea of woke corporate politics. Monday's commentary was on that subject, and but as I've said before, if you go woke, you get broke. And it has been interesting because there has been a significant amount of pushback from individuals. And since we are broadcasting in South Carolina, tomorrow we'll be broadcasting in Georgia, where you see Coca-Cola and Delta and all the rest. There have now been some attempts to push back corporately because you have what is called the Consumers Research. It's a conservative nonprofit, and they've actually put together a campaign that's almost like an election campaign. And I'm not necessarily agreeing with everything that's said in these ads, but I thought it was kind of interesting because once all of a sudden some of these prominent CEOs start getting political, and they're allowed, obviously, individually to address that. But now when they want to put the full force of their company or their corporation behind that, I think the assumption is they can get as political as they want, and it will be cost-free. Well, not necessarily. And so what has been interesting is the campaign so far, which was launched on Tuesday by Consumers Research, really took aim at Nike, Coca-Cola, and American Airlines. And these are kind of like 30-second spots. Most of the time they're airing on national cable news, but they've also been, in a couple of cases, being aired in local markets where the companies are headquartered. So we'll find out a little bit more about that when we're up there in Georgia tomorrow. But each ad, as this article points out, treats the company kind of like a political candidate. Now, after all, if you're going to get political, well, then we'll take you on just like you're an opponent in a political process. And so they start taking on their reputation. Nike, for example, they talk about the fact, okay, you went out with a woke former quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, but rather than hiring Americans, Nike chose China. And the ad then goes into some detail and claims that the company produces shoes in a factory in regions that used forced labor from the Uyghurs. Nike now says, no, we did not do that. The code of conduct prohibits that. So we'll see the kind of back and forth that will take place there. One of the other ads goes after Coca-Cola and the CEO for opposing the voting laws in Georgia. And then a third ad goes after American Airlines, which didn't have as much to say about Georgia, but American Airlines is located in the state of Texas, and there's right now considering an issue there as well. And so the ad asks, so why is the CEO trying to appease the radical left, to distract from billions in taxpayer bailouts from his $10 million payday? That would be Doug Parker, who's the CEO of American Airlines, from America's record layoffs. And it takes the airline to task for losing baggage. I think that happened to us yesterday, shrinking legroom, and a variety of other things, and then now attacking Texas voter IDs. So if nothing else, since we lost our bags, I can relate to that somewhat. Now, again, this particular piece that we've posted here comes from our good friends at the Wall Street Journal, and they say, okay, some of the attacks are somewhat excessive, just like you, of course, see sometimes to a political campaign. You can't, of course, blame everything on American Airlines for airline layoffs because of COVID-19. You can't blame Coca-Cola for everybody getting diabetes because of sugary drinks. So I get that. But nevertheless, I thought it was really interesting to see some of the push there as well. And if nothing else, The question that the editors of the Wall Street Journal were asking are, look, we recognize there may be different justifications for why these CEOs have decided to get so woke. Some may be speaking out of conviction, though some ill-informed about the political fights that they've joined, such as state voting laws. You heard Kelly Shackelford sharing about one individual which was asked, what part of the Texas law that would require a voter ID do you disagree with? And he said, well, I don't know. I haven't even read the law. So you can see that in some respects, this reminds me a little bit of junior high school. If one of the prominent individuals believes it's important that everybody joins suit. And so then, of course, you have some of the other organizations, like, say, Nike, that oftentimes do flaunt their leftist positions, as they point out. But if nothing else, one of the things that the Wall Street Journal editors conclude by saying is, look, this woke business trend isn't healthy for a free market cause. CEOs risk undermining support on the grassroots and congressional right for businesses, mirroring the anti-corporate sentiment that dominates the left. CEOs can never buy enough absolution from the left as long as they believe in profit, and alienating the right leaves them friendless. We warned CEOs that this would happen when they went for woke, and now it has. So this is just one of those ads, and Real Clear Politics went into a little bit more of this as well, because what you see is that some of those individuals that have been attacked are now starting to say, okay, we respect everyone's right to raise their concerns and express their views, but if nothing else, we're going to come together to listen. So you're starting to see some of the corporations trying to back off just a little bit. But I thought just real quickly I would quote from something I found in another article from the executive director of Consumers Research. Again, it is a conservative nonprofit. And they said, to the extent that Coca-Cola's latest statement is a commitment to stop serving the politicians and focusing on its customers, it's promising, because now they're saying, well, we're willing to listen. So Coca-Cola seems to have backed off a little bit. While Will Held, who is the executive director, said, to the extent that it's just hand-waving and trying to act like there's no problem, like they haven't been distracting from their bad business practices and problems with their products and how they treat customers, it's just more of the same. So we will see indeed what is going to happen. There have been some people that have already, as you might imagine, concerned that Consumers Research gets money from individuals and they don't disclose their donors. So you're going to see this, of course, coming up as well. But nevertheless, you think that there is certainly this idea that up until now, many of these woke corporations have thought they could say anything with impunity, and that simply didn't work quite as well. So again, going back to Nike, I love this. Rather than hire Americans, Nike chose China, and the CEO, stop exploiting foreign labor, serve your customers, not woke politicians. So if nothing else, want to take a break, and when we come back, first of all, we're going to have a chance, I think, to speak with the pastor here at Community Bible Church, Dr. Carl Broggi, and then we're in South Carolina, so very good piece by Senator Tim Scott. So lots of things to cover, but we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation right here from WAGP.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, and we are broadcasting from WAGP here in South Carolina. And just before we get back into some of the issues in the news, a very good piece, an op-ed by Senator Tim Scott. We're going to talk about what are some of the economic implications of some of these policies. Former Senator Phil Gramm will be talking about that, and Senator Rick Scott will be talking about it. We'll get into a variety of other topics, but I thought it would be just great if we could, for just a few minutes, spend some time talking with Dr. Carl Broggi. He is the pastor of Community Bible Church. You've been here almost 30 years, I understand.
Almost 31.
Yeah,
yes,
so
that's right.
Oh, 30 plus. And
yes.
So a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, has his doctorate from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I wanted to get you on, first of all, to encourage people to actually go and find Search the Scriptures radio program, which is broadcast from here. And for those of you that are pastors, I might just mention his series right now, which I know you preached a number of years ago, but still very relevant, 3 responsibilities of pastors for his people and his people, because we have a lot of pastors that listen. But I wanted to have you on, first of all, because one of the convictions that you've had for many years is the need for us in the church to really engage in evangelism. And the most recent survey that we've done through Pro Ministries, which was a survey of more than 3,000, it finds that very few individuals are sharing their faith. We have these huge churches. I attend a mega church, Prestonwood Baptist Church. This is a mega church by anybody's definition. And yet the larger the structures, the less impact on the culture. What about that?
Yeah, it's sad. I think we've gathered a lot of unbelievers under the umbrella of trying to be seeker sensitive. And in the process, we've compromised the message, and people don't really even
Crossway,
the answers
1,300
that
pages.
people will give you in these churches. And so I think we need to get back to the basics, encountering individuals, asking them some questions, see what they understand, and try to share Christ with them directly and help them to understand what a decision for Christ means.
You know, one of the things that we do at Point of View is we try to talk about how to articulate a biblical worldview, but then we also spend a fair amount of time talking about how to defend a biblical worldview, which is called apologetics.
Right.
And I know that there are a number of reasons why people don't share their faith. One of those could be that they don't have that many non-Christian friends. Another could possibly be, indeed, that they find themselves saying, I'm not sure I know how to answer those questions. But if nothing else, it seems to me that one of the possibilities is that they just are a little bit fearful. But the good news is I can pull out my smartphone here and find the answers to the questions that the typical skeptic might be asking, right?
You're right. There's really nothing new under the sun, as Solomon said. And I teach a course. It's a basic discipleship course for new believers. And in that, we deal with what I call the 10 most commonly asked questions. And I would say 99% of the questions that unbelievers ask would fall under that umbrella, and most of those under just 5 questions. So knowing, yes, how to respond intelligently, but if you know Christ is your Savior, if you truly do, then you know the plan of salvation, because it's impossible to be saved without knowing the plan of salvation. And someone, all they need to do is to start to say, I may not know the answer to your question, but let me at least share with you what the Bible says is the way to be forgiven. And many times those questions are nothing more than smoke screens that fall by the wayside, Sometimes they're asked from honest, searching hearts, but most of the time they're just smoke screens. And if we give people the plan of salvation and how they can be forgiven, folks would be shocked at how many would respond.
And I think there's another part of that, and that is I run into sometimes people say, well, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in what the Bible says about God. And I usually stop, and I'm sure you probably do this.
Work of many scholars of Scripture who have gone in generations previous to me.
Well, again, just very well done, and just a compendium of all sorts of issues. Let's get into the introduction for just a minute. A lot of times when I ask people, how do we...
A man may say there's no God, or I don't know if there's a God, but in his heart of hearts, he knows there is because of the creation around and the conscience within. But you're right. Sometimes you can say, well, you say I don't believe the Bible. What do you think its basic message is in terms of the way of salvation? Because it is a book of salvation. And 99% of the time, as you said, they give the wrong answer, and then you can just come back gently and say, you're rejecting a book whose message you don't even understand. Can I share it with you?
Very good. Just before I let you go, though, I know you are a busy pastor, but one of the other things we want to talk about is the need for pastors to address the issues from the pulpit. If indeed we find that some people are getting an unclear signal from the pulpit about evangelism, they're oftentimes getting an unclear signal from the pulpit about cultural engagement, don't you think?
I think so. And again, what we've done is we've not only sacrificed the Bible's message of salvation, we've sacrificed expository preaching. So people are doctrinally illiterate, and they don't know what the Scripture speaks on a host of issues. Pastors are afraid to address it because they don't want to lose their constituency, and they are amassing huge numbers of people that are unconverted and unregenerate. But it is our job to preach the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, whatever the issue may be, however difficult it may be. That's our responsibility, and that's what God calls us to do. And someday, as pastors, that's what He judges us on. The wood, hay, stubble, gold, silver, precious stone analysis in the context is in reference to pastors and whether or not they are faithfully utilizing the tool God has given them, the Word of God, to build His church.
And I know that you even took the time to encourage some of your listeners and some of the people in your congregation to go out there and let the city council know about a particular piece of legislation or something that city council was considering.
We did. They wanted to prohibit pastors, Christian counselors, etc., from counseling anyone under the age of 18 against transgender homosexual behavior. And listen, those things are wrong. Those are moral issues. They want to usurp our spiritual freedoms. And if we were to do it, they were threatening arrest by the police. But they were inundated with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and emails just from our church alone, and they backed off, at least for now. So we'll see.
Well, again, those are the kind of issues that I think we're going to have to address. And it seems to me that the great challenge today is on the sexuality, LGBTQ issues.
Yes.
But one other one that I know is of your concern is just this whole kind of woke theology and things like that. So I appreciate the fact that you're willing to speak out on those issues and educate your congregation. And I would encourage people to go Search the Scriptures, because they're going to get great Bible teaching, aren't they?
SearchTheScriptures.org. There's a phone app, and you can listen to entire books of the Bible, whether it's Revelation or 1 Timothy or Daniel or Romans or Acts or whatever book you're studying. We will literally, by God's grace, we've gone through every single verse. And if you really want to study God's Word or a particular issue or topic, that would be a great place to go.
I love the expository preaching, and thank you, Pastor, for being here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have some comments from an op-ed by Senator Tim Scott. I think you will appreciate that, and we will be back right after the break. And once we get into some of these other economic issues, we will take some time to break those out. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of those calls remotely as we broadcast today from WAGP. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
If you pay people for not working, then people aren't likely to go out and look for work. Most of us would think that's basic common sense, but apparently that eluded so many in Congress, except for a few senators like Ben Sass and Lindsey Graham. Months ago, they warned that providing high unemployment benefits to those out of work would create a disincentive. 2 weeks ago, the April jobs report lamented that there were only 266,000 jobs created in the month. Economists have been predicting more than 1 million jobs would be created in April. At the time, the president had difficulty explaining why so few jobs were created, but he was sure that it was Trump's fault. In fact, he made the unbelievable claim that there were no measurable data that people weren't looking for jobs because it pays more not to work. You know, the president needs to get out more and talk to employers trying to do all they can to hire people for positions readily available. One article did a quick calculation and concluded that workers could get nearly $16 an hour by staying home. That is more than double the federal minimum wage. Bank of America estimated that anyone making less than $32,000 or less would be better off staying on unemployment than going back to work. More than a week ago, Senator Ben Sass called this a clear policy failure at work. There are 7.4 million jobs open in the United States, but fewer than 300,000 people found work. Senator Tim Scott concluded that Democrats are disincentivizing work, pushing billions of wasteful spending, and threatening major tax hikes. Sadly, the president and Congress don't seem interested in changing course. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Carl Broggi, I think, raised some very good questions, and that is certainly the need for us to be engaged in evangelism. But back to those of you that are pastors, Bible teachers, small group leaders, and others, just the need for us to address these issues. I know people have said they appreciate Point of View for no other reason than you can't cover all the topics, and I understand that from the pulpit of a church, and that's why I think it's important to teach those in a Sunday school class, but I hope it's also important for you to be listening to Point of View to address many of these issues, because after all, we are dealing with a variety of different topics almost every single day here on Point of View. We've talked about the Capitol Riot Commission. We've talked about the attempt to pack the court through the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. We've talked about what is a crisis at the border in terms of illegal individuals and aliens coming from all over the world. We've talked about the corporate politics and the whole idea of wokeism, and we're going to get into a couple of other issues. And those are things that need to be addressed. Now, we shouldn't turn our church or our pulpits into a political action committee, but at the same time, if we do not educate members of our church about these issues, where are they going to learn about those? So let's open up the phones and give you a chance to join the conversation. Maybe you have some thoughts about what pastors can be doing, or maybe you are a pastor or have certainly attended church where your pastor, like Dr. Carl Broggi, actually addresses those issues. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. But since I'm in South Carolina, I wanted to talk about Senator Tim Scott And he, of course, is somebody we've quoted on a regular basis, but he had an op-ed come out yesterday, and so I thought, well, what a great opportunity to actually talk about this. And what he's talking about is what's called Senate Bill 1. Now, if you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that we have been talking about what was, of course, H.R. 1 and now Senate Bill 1. It passed the House, and now it's the Senate. And he was talking about the fact that as he was preparing to give the response to President Biden's joint address to Congress, which was kind of a little bit like a State of the Union address, but not exactly. He said he wanted to reflect on some of the issues facing America. But one of the ones that is of great concern to him, and to, I know, many of you, because you've been contacting members of Congress about this, is what is called Senate Bill 1, because it is now in the Senate. And I love the way Senator Tim Scott puts it. He says, of the many issues I shared with the country, I know it was important that to call out the dishonest narrative peddled by various politicians in the mainstream media on the issue of election reform. And then I love his line. He says, as a black man who has voted in the South all my life, voting rights are personal to me. He says, as I said in my speech, I support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. So do my fellow Republicans, and so do voters. By the way, if you look at any of the surveys, if people really understand what these pieces of legislation would actually do, and what this particular piece of legislation would do, you can see that that's a concern. And so he says the Democrats have this so-called For the People Act, which would actually, he says, make it easier to cheat and harder to vote. It's not a voting rights bill. It's a partisan power grab that would destroy confidence in our election system. And so that's his statement. And you might think, okay, well, that's a lot of rhetoric. Can you give me some evidence? And he says, okay, here's a list of terrible ideas in the bill. And he says the list of ideas in the bill is so long, it really would be longer than his op-ed piece. So we're going to pick out just a few. He says, first of all, the various proponents of this, and that would be President Joe Biden, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, he says, want you to deposit your tax dollars into a political campaign accounts. That means your money could be spent on ads for candidates you don't support, attacking the ones that you do. So here is this attempt to, quote, get money out of the election process. We've heard that before, but the harsh reality is that if nothing else, we are now seeing more and more people pushing it in that direction. Second of all, he says that they would want to turn the nonpartisan Federal Election Commission into a partisan disaster. He says tipping the scales of the independent agency in charge of enforcing campaign finance rules would politicize decisions impacting every candidate for federal office. And he understands that since he's run, obviously, for the United States Senate. He goes on to say their plan would make fraud harder to detect by allowing unlimited ballot harvesting all across the country. Each election year, there are stories of political operatives succumbing to the temptation to tamper with ballots they're paid to collect. Even worse are the stories of bad actors deceiving voters, especially the elderly. And since we're broadcasting today from South Carolina, can I remind everybody that they actually had to redo a congressional election in North Carolina because of the issue of ballot harvesting. And then he has one more, and then I'll take some phone calls. He says, among the most egregious provisions is the push to gut voter ID laws. The prevailing liberal argument that voter ID requirements are unpopular and aimed at suppressing the minority vote, he says, is simply not rooted in facts. In a Senate committee hearing last week, Democrats made the case for their proposals by repeating those false claims. But he says a recent polling shows that a majority of Americans are in favor of voter ID requirements, including large majorities of black people and Hispanics. Those are his words. And again, if you looked at any of those facts and figures, you can recognize that that is the case. So if you find yourself saying, I've got some neighbors, friends, coworkers, or others that just are convinced that this is simply an attempt at voter suppression and we need Senate Bill 1, let me encourage you to get, I think it's the third article on our list here by Senator Tim Scott, an op-ed that came out, and very definitely goes through a lot of very important issues. And of course, if you have been listening to Point of View, it's one of our action alerts. It's not the one posted right now, but if you click on more alerts, you will see that it's the second one in case you want to get some more facts and figures. But let's take some phone calls. If you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First of all, we'll head out to California, KYCC. Jeff, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, I was just been listening, and I know we all need, as Christians, we should be in agreement on these items, but I was coming from a little bit different perspective. One thing I've been noticing in the church is it seems like we've been in an area of division with different doctrines and stuff where there have been way too many churches kind of getting off base and straying from truth and biblical doctrine. And so until we're unified in the church front, I think we're going to have a very hard time being unified on the political front.
Well said. And again, that is something that Dr. Carl Broggi has been concerned about as well, just the kind of the fudging on essential doctrines of the faith. We recognize that sometimes there may be some intramural disagreements between denominations, but if we can't come to a point where we agree, at least on some of the fundamentals that we've talked about with George Barna, and he points out that only about 6% of American adults have a biblical worldview. And when he talks about a biblical worldview, he's just talking about kind of Sunday School 101. Well, then you might wonder, well, what are the other people believe? And what he has found is, I think it's about 88% of those believe in what you might call syncretism. Syncretism's a big word we talked about the other day, which simply says kind of, I'm going to pick and choose what I believe, and nothing necessarily correlates with Christianity. So part of it is that if you're a pastor listening right now, I think you need to give a very clear set of teaching from the pulpit about those issues. And Jeff, I think you're right. I mean, how can we be united if on just kind of fundamental doctrines of the faith we are in disagreement? So I think that the whole question of the church drifting away from Christianity is part of the problem, because if we were united as believers and spoke with at least some kind of clear voice, I think we would obviously be making a very profound difference in the culture today.
Yeah, you said it much better than I could.
Well, appreciate that. By the way, I'm hoping to see you because we're heading out to California. I think it's in the fall. So we will be at our good friends at KYCC. And, of course, we're at our friends today at WAGP. And so I'm looking forward to that opportunity. And for those of you in the California area, we'll get to see you in the future. And, of course, tonight, hopefully, we'll get to see some from South Carolina, tomorrow in Georgia. And I'll try to stay awake, but after eating all this great barbecue, I'm not sure how well I'm going to do. So we'll see how we will do. But we need to take a break. And when we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues, one of which is a piece that I thought would be helpful for you to hear from, and that is from the former senator from Texas, Phil Gramm, who was a PhD and economics professor, and then, of course, the current senator from Florida, Rick Scott, on Biden's plans are already hurting the recovery. In some respects, he's saying some of the things we've been saying, but we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And Thank you so very much for listening today. We are broadcasting from the remote studio here. Actually, it's in a very nice studio, but we have all the remote equipment, WAGP. Tomorrow we'll be in Georgia, and if you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But if you don't mind, I thought for just a minute we might convene a session on the economy. And economics is going to be more and more important, if for no other reason than the fact is that I think because of so much money printing, we are going to be headed for inflation. Now, if you have access to the website, pointofview.net, and you want to go to the viewpoints, we mentioned the one today that talks about the fact that there are a lot of help wanted signs everywhere. But a couple of days ago, and that would be on Tuesday and then on Wednesday, we talked on Tuesday about inflation. And it has been intriguing to me to hear that even the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that'd be Jerome Powell, said, I don't think there's much problem with inflation. And if nothing else, he says M2 does not really have important implications. So I thought I'd educate you a little bit. And if you go to the website, we have a link to what is called the M2 money supply, or you don't even have to go there. Just get your computer out or your cell phone out, go to Google or Bing or whatever you use, and just type in M2 money stock. What you'll see popping up here is a graph, and it should scare you because the graph, first of all, shows that since 2008, the amount of money being produced by the Federal Reserve is increasing. But then when you get to 2002, it just goes vertical. And so that's the first thing that you will notice. And then the second thing you'll notice is the graph is titled discontinued. Now, the reason it's discontinued is the Federal Reserve has given up trying to keep a weekly update on all the money being printed. And now there's still a monthly one. And so if you want to understand what's coming, when they now can't even post honestly the production of the money supply, we're in real trouble. So the point I'm making is right now people are saying, well, we don't have too much inflation. It's a little harder to say now when they came out with saying inflation's 4%, which will get me to my Wednesday column in just a minute. But even at that, you've got to recognize that prices are going up. Have you gone to the grocery store lately and tried to buy some of these things? Have you gone to a gas station? Some of that price increase is due to a change perhaps in supply chain. Lumber has gone up 180%. Some say it's gone up 280%. Depending on which floor baseline you're using. But that has added an additional, as I point out in my Tuesday commentary, almost an additional $36,000 additionally just to building an average priced home, $35,872 in particular coming from the National Association of Home Builders. And as a result, you shouldn't be surprised that home prices have gone up more than 15% in Austin, more than 9% in Los Angeles. And you can go around the country and see that some of that may be due to the pandemic and lockdown, but quite frankly, a great deal of that is due, if no other reason, than the increase in the money supply. About 35% of all the dollars in the world were produced in the last year. And more money chasing fewer goods, we know what that means. That's called inflation. My commentary yesterday just simply takes on the idea of the consumer price index because people saying, well, it's only 4%. But I point out that if you use the same kind of index that was used back in 1980, you would say that it's probably closer to 12%. And so that, again, is a great concern for the issue of inflation. And so I might just mention very quickly, and then I'll take some phone calls, that one of the other issues is being written about by Phil Graham and Rick Scott. One of the things I loved about the fact that back in the 1980s is you had a couple of individuals that were economics professors. That would be Dick Armey and Phil Graham, one in the House, one in the Senate. And if nothing else, if you at least have somebody in the United States Senate or somebody in the United States House of Representatives that understands economics, maybe they can teach the rest of them. And their argument that is now coming out from the Wall Street Journal is, quote, Biden's plans are already hurting the economy. And they go into incredible detail in which they recognize, again, the issue of inflation. They said inflation is basically too much money chasing too few goods. And it may seem old-fashioned to ask this brave new world of modern monetary theory, where Joe Biden declared last year that Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore, is there reason to be concerned about the fact that the money supply, M2, grew by 24% over last year. Now it's up to 35%, adding what's been happening here. And, of course, if you don't think that's enough, Joe Biden wants to spend trillions of dollars more, as we've talked about on this program. So, again, what they point out is that we need to look at some of the issues that were used in the past to try to evaluate what is happening in the economy. And it certainly is the case, as they point out, that the U.S. economy has the power to iron out some of the problems of restarting production. Because after all, we closed down a lot of these companies, or the companies were able not to run at full capacity. But he says now the problem is when you then add to this the subsidies of about $6 trillion from the Biden administration in stimulus, then you have the relief and infrastructure bills constraining production. Is they said this is almost providing a disincentive for growing the economy. So if nothing else, they near the end say that the Biden administration also is asking Americans to believe that it can raise income corporate taxes. First of all, raise income taxes, raise corporate taxes, and raise death taxes, or the so-called inheritance tax, smother the private sector with regulations, kill the fossil fuel industry, and fill the regulatory agencies with activists fundamentally hostile to the nation's economic system, and still try to, with a straight face, say that that would have no impact on economic performance. And I think, again, we have enough common sense to begin to understand some of those issues. So again, their conclusion is if Congress sees inflation as a real threat, that it should stop spending. That's kind of common sense. When you're in a hole and you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And this is where we find ourselves right now. They said any unobligated balances in the Biden stimulus or previous stimulus bills can no longer be justified under current economic circumstances and should be rescinded. They said rescinding the spending authority in the Biden stimulus at the end of the fiscal year on September 30th would save $710 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Organization, in office, I should say, and rescinding the authority sooner and including all previous stimulus bills would again save another $1 trillion. So again, sometimes when we talk about $1 trillion, it's hard to get that in your head. Let's recognize that when Ronald Reagan came into office and took over the Oval Office after Jimmy Carter, that entire national debt was $1 trillion. From George Washington all the way to Ronald Reagan, $1 trillion. Now we talk about $1 trillion as if it's monopoly money, which is sort of what it's becoming. And at $28 trillion, you can obviously see some of the problems that we're dealing with there. So again, they said if inflation of the 1970s and 80s has returned, then we are dealing with something very different. And he says, once again, it is an attempt to have to teach people that, I love these lines, that water is wet, that fire will burn, and government can't give something for nothing. And so, again, we are headed for, I think, again, a time of increased inflation. For some of our listeners here in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and other places, you know what happened when you just had a shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline for a few days. It started looking like the 1970s. And I'm in a studio today with a lot of people that remember that, but when we have our Millennial Roundtable on Monday coming up, they were not around in the 1970s to remember the long gas lines. They were not around when you had inflation anywhere from 17% to 20%. The first house I ever purchased, I was able to get at 5%, and I thought I hit the lottery. And now 5% would be seen as unbelievable, but that shows you what could happen in the future if we don't get our fiscal house in order. So if nothing else, we're going to continue talking about some of these economic issues. In some respects, people say, I wish you didn't bring such bad news. Well, I'd rather tell you the truth. And even tonight, when I'm speaking to a group of individuals, we're going to say, it's better to tell the truth than to try to make it sound better than it really is. And one of the harsh realities coming from former Senator Bill Graham and Senator Rick Scott, two individuals that understand the economy, is that we are putting this nation in a very precarious situation. So just as we are hearing people say, oh, there's not a crisis at the border, there's not an immigration crisis, we're going to hear there's not an inflation crisis. But I think you know better by simply going to the grocery store and looking at how prices are going up. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, broadcasting again from WAGP. It's just been a great opportunity to be here in South Carolina. Looking forward to meeting a few people tonight, and then we're off to Georgia tomorrow, so I hope you'll be listening. And while we're talking about economic issues, let me just mention next week I've got a commentary coming out called Middle Class Fragility, because some of you hearing some of these economic issues were saying we're in a difficult situation, and it reminded me of something that happened a couple of years ago where the Federal Reserve Board, we just talked about them a minute ago, actually conducted a survey. They asked a number of people if you had a $400 unanticipated expense, an emergency expense, it was unexpected, what could you do? And it was interesting that nearly half of the people said, I'd have to borrow money or sell something. In other words, they could not come up with money to pay that. Now, if you look at the fact that we have been through a pandemic and a lockdown, those percentages have gone up precipitously. I'd like them to ask the question again, but I think we can understand that. And the problem problem with it is that we oftentimes don't talk about it. Because I talked about a piece that came out in The Atlantic a number of years ago by Neil Gabler, and he said, $400, people couldn't come up with $400. And he said, who knew? And he said, I knew, because I was one of those people. And he said, this is what's so interesting, because I knew what it was like, he said, to dread going to the mailbox because it usually had more new bills and rarely a check to pay for them. He knew what it was like to tell his daughter that he may not be able to pay for his wedding. But he said you wouldn't know it looking at me, because if you looked at his resume, you'd say, well, he's at least middle class. He's written a couple of books. He's written all sorts of articles that have his name on it. And he called that the secret shame of middle class Americans. And so in some respects, I know some of you may be struggling with that right now, especially as you see prices going up. And if nothing else, you have many times said, well, I got a check from the government, and it was great, but it didn't even come close to covering my expenses. And I know some of you perhaps have lost your job, or you had a business that you had to close down, or all the rest. And so I have now found that there is a pretty good evidence that about half of American adults are what we would call financially fragile and are living close to the financial edge. And so if nothing else, this is why we want to cover some of these issues here on Point of View and get you thinking about that. But if nothing else, we wanted to take some time just to cover some of those economic issues, because they are affecting you and your family, and we're going to be covering those in the future. But I thought we would end, if I could, for just a few minutes talking about UFOs. Who would have guessed we've been talking about UFOs on Point of View? As I said yesterday, or the day before, part of that is brought about by Senator Marco Rubio, because he is required, and now members of the Senate have actually required, that an intelligence report be issued. On Sunday, you had everything from 60 Minutes covering this. Matt Walsh covered this. To Monday on his show, Tucker Carlson covered this. And it has been something that Jim Garrity said, the conventional wisdom on UFOs must be shifting, and quotes about the fact that no less a figure than the former President Barack Obama is weighing in on that. He was on the Late Show with Jim Corden, in which former President Barack Obama said, what is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there is footage and records of objects in the sky that don't know exactly what they are. He continued, we can't explain how they move, their trajectory. They don't have an easy explanation, and so we need to investigate them and find out what they are. Well, Jim Garrity has a little bit of fun talking about, well, what are your possibilities? One possibility is it's a secret government technology or military technology. And if nothing else, he said there is a lot of evidence that Donald Trump used to talk about this super-duper missile. Remember, he talked about this super-duper missile, and it was supposed to be 17 times faster than what we have right now. Could be, but is that what this is? I don't know. You would think that at this point there would be government officials that would know about this. Now, I love Jim Garrity said, former President Barack Obama could be lying. He says, come on, it's happened before. But nevertheless, we would think that the highest levels of the U.S. government would know these things, but nevertheless, would they be going through such an elaborate effort to cover them over, especially when a lot of these have been seen, for example, off the coast of Virginia Beach? One of the things on 60 Minutes, one of these naval pilots said, I see this almost every day. So what is that? And again, would you spend time buzzing the coast of Virginia Beach, or would you still be going to Iran, buzzing their nuclear research facility? So that doesn't fit quite so well. Is it a military operation? Well, you would think that a lot of these companies are oftentimes itching to showcase those to the world. So that is at least one possibility. The second is this is secret technology from a private sector company. You have SpaceX, Elon Musk. Is that what he's working on right now? Hard to imagine that as well. And given the technology that we've seen so far, doesn't look like it's coming from them, which leads to the third argument. Maybe it's secret technology from an unfriendly country. I mean, we know that China has been developing its own stealth fighters, and so that is at least a possibility. Russia has an unmanned combat air vehicle being tested right now. Some of the drones could look alien, so maybe it's something like that. But again, if you, as he says, had this technology, would you be flying around off the coast of Virginia Beach every day for at least a couple of years? And aren't we necessarily going to try to be more aggressive? And if anything, if indeed we're noticing that China is becoming more aggressive and acting more confident, wouldn't they want to display some of this technology rather than to hide it? And so that's when Jim Garrity says, well, there's one other option, and that is they're aliens, which I thought was kind of interesting. He said, weirdly, if these are alien aircraft, that is at least reassuring, because if they were hostile foreign power, it would look like some of the things we've seen in our science fiction films. So maybe they're more akin to Star Trek. Remember, the Star Trek has the prime directive, so they're not supposed to interfere with any kind of technological development. So maybe that's a possibility as well. Well, I had some fun with that the other day and pointed out that certainly they could be extraterrestrial, or they could even be interdimensional. And so that's one of the reasons why some people have said, I wonder if there's something related to the fact that these do not seem to follow the physical laws of the universe. Because even if it was extraterrestrial, they would still be governed under the same laws of gravity and physics and force and all the rest. And so whatever is going on is that we've gone from a time just a few decades ago in the late 1960s where we had what was called the Blue Book, which just pretty much dismissed most of the UFOs as nothing more than swamp gas or balloons or a variety of other things, to now the fact that there is going to be a report that is going to be issued by the intelligence community. And if you'd asked me even this time last week whether I'd be talking about UFOs, I'd say probably not. But when 60 Minutes covers it, when Tucker Carlson covers it, when Matt Walsh covers it, okay, we'll mention it as well. So this is the fourth article we've posted today. If you want to find a very good kind of critique from a Christian point of view, which is a book that was published a number of years ago, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, that's in our Tuesday Point of View article, and it's available for you there as well. Everything from a riot commission to the economy to UFOs. We cover it all here on Point of View. So I hope you've enjoyed listening today. I want to thank Andrew and Warren and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I hope that you've appreciated the conversation, and I hope you'll be joining us tomorrow, because we'll be broadcasting from our friends at the Good News Network right there in Augusta, Georgia. So have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.